As a writer and a reader, I've always been really fascinated by how a story is made. And by that I don't necessarily mean what was the author's writing routine while they wrote the story. I more so mean, how did the author go from the very first inkling of an idea through all the messy drafts, all the way to the published manuscript, and how did the story grow and change and evolve in ways that the author might have not expected during that whole process. The Lord of the Rings in particular has always stood as this beacon of imaginative majesty in my mind. It doesn't seem like a book that somebody actually wrote down in words. It seems like kind of it just sprang fully formed from the mind of a genius. I think because The Lord of the Rings feels so complete and self-contained, I never really imagined what it would have been like for Tolkien to kind of discover the story as he was writing it. That is, until I read this book. So Humphrey Carpenter was the authorized biographer of Tolkien, which means that in the years leading up to and following Tolkien's death in 1973, Carpenter was actually granted access to most of Tolkien's papers, letters, drafts, diaries, maps, all of that kind of thing, in order to put this biography together. But what was especially interesting to me about this book is how Carpenter managed to actually piece together a timeline of how The Lord of the Rings was crafted from the first idea to that actual writing of the book itself. So today in this video, very much riffing off this biography, we're going to be tracing the writing of The Lord of the Rings all the way from the very first inception all the way to the actual writing of the book to publication, just to kind of trace the long and beautiful and arduous process that brought us this magnificent masterpiece. Okay. First, to truly understand The Lord of the Rings, I'm just going to keep this in my hand so I can keep gesturing with it because this is really going to help me. So the first thing to note about Tolkien's childhood that I think is really crucial for our understanding of who he is he lost his father and mother both when he was really young. So Tolkien was actually born in Africa on January 3rd, 1892. His father was in the banking industry and his parents had moved to Africa shortly after they were married to kind of pursue his career. So John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, as we know him today, didn't actually returned to England until he was 3 years old, and that was originally just intended to be kind of a quick visit with relatives, but then while they were in England they received word that their father had passed away of rheumatic fever back in Africa. So because of this, Tolkien, his mother, and his brother ended up moving around quite a lot in his childhood, so they never really had a real settled home of their own. So they did spend several years living in this beautiful countryside town called Sarehole, which eventually would become the inspiration for the Shire. But then they also ended up moving to Birmingham, where Tolkien would kind of finish out his education prior to moving to Oxford. But then Tolkien also lost his mother when he was 12 years old. After this, he and his brother were taken in by a local clergyman of the Catholic Church who kind of oversaw their education until they were of age. A couple other things that I think are interesting to note about Tolkien's childhood is that he loved drawing, especially trees, and he also had a real knack for languages. And when I say a real knack for languages, I mean that by the time he was in college, this man knew English, Latin, French, Greek, German, Middle English, Old English, also known as Anglo-Saxon, Finnish, Gothic, Italian, Old Norse, also known as Old Icelandic, Spanish, Welsh, and Medieval Welsh. And then in addition to learning all of these languages, he also began inventing his own, as you do. So one of the earliest ones he created was called Nefarin, which was influenced by Spanish. And then he also created Quenya, which was kind of modeled on Finnish, one of his favorite languages. And that would eventually become High Elven in the Lord of the Rings series. And then he also eventually created a language called Sindarin. Sindarin? I don't know, I just read, I don't pronounce. So in addition to languages, Tolkien also had a very deep love for mythologies and folk tales. In fact, he saw the two as connected, where the people of a culture are inextricably linked by the language that they speak and the stories that have shaped them. So of all of the mythologies and the languages that he studied, there were 3 in particular that seemed to hold a special significance or resonance for him. And I jotted those down because I thought at a future point it would be interesting to go back and read the ones that I haven't read yet. So the first one was from Old English, also known as Anglo-Saxon, which is the poem Beowulf. And a lot of you guys will know that Tolkien did a lot of academic work, not only translating Beowulf, but writing a lot of academic papers on the subject of Beowulf. Secondly was the Finnish Kalevala, I really hope I'm saying that right, which really influenced the way he was going to approach writing the Silmarillion in future years. And then the third big influence for him was from Old Norse, also known as Old Icelandic, and that was the Poetic or Elder Edda and the Prose or Younger Edda. So those 3 were hugely informative in the way that he kind of shaped his imagination moving forward. So it kind of came as a natural consequence that as he studied languages, he also wanted to create the mythologies that kind of paired along with them. In particular, as Tolkien was kind of approaching this idea of creating mythology, he sort of had this secret ambition to create a mythology for England itself. So later on in his life, recollecting his kind of youthful ambitions, Tolkien said this: "Do not laugh, but once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend. ranging from the large and cosmogenic to the level of romantic fairy story. The larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the Northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the East. And while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair, elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things. It should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Absurd though he may have considered this ambition, I actually find it incredible that it's this kind of vision that he had when he was young that really fueled him and gave him kind of the vision to create the Silmarillion and everything after. So I think he did actually achieve a startling amount of what he set out to do. So kind of clipping along through Tolkien's childhood a bit, while he was at King Edward's, he also struck up a really close friendship with this group of school friends who would become very formative influences in his life. So among this Marauders-esque group, if you will, there were 4 central characters. So first of all, of course, we have John Ronald, as he was known to his friends, who was very educated in Germanic languages and philology, very immersed in Northern writers. Secondly was Christopher Wiseman, who was very interested in the natural sciences, in music. He was a mathematician, a composer. And third was R.Q. Gilson, Robert Quilter Gilson, who was son of the headmaster of King Edward's. He was interested in drawing, design. He was very quiet but witty, and he was very interested in Renaissance art and 18th century works as well. And then fourth and finally, there was J.B. Smith, who was a little bit more on the modern edge of the education spectrum. Like the others were more interested in the classics, and he was more knowledgeable about modern English literature and poetry in particular. So these 4 steadfast friends had humble origins in what was known as the Tea Club, which was kind of this unofficial group that met secretly in the school library to have tea. And gradually, when the summer term was over, they moved their location from the library to Barrow's stores nearby. And their name would change to kind of reflect their new location, and they called themselves the Barrovian Society. So in the years to come, they would refer to themselves as the Tea Club and Barrovian Society, also known as the t.c.b.s. While they each pursued their own career, they would meet as often as they could to kind of read aloud or do recitations or encourage each other, and Christopher Wiseman later described that they felt 4 times the intellectual size when they were together. They kind of mutually inspired each other, and they began to hope that they might do something of value in the world. So these 4 tightly knit friends continued to stay close right up until they were sent to the trenches in World War I. So Tolkien was actually in the trenches when he received the news that Rob Gilson had been killed in action. He and the rest of the t.c.b.s were absolutely devastated. Tolkien was stationed in an area where there was really heavy fighting, and Tolkien would have likely followed the same fate as a lot of his fallen comrades if he hadn't succumbed to trench fever and been sent home to England to recover. When Tolkien had recovered and been reunited with his wife Edith, he received news from Christopher Wiseman that their friend G.B. Smith had been killed by a burst shell. In Smith's final letter to Tolkien, he wrote this: "My chief consolation is that if I am scuppered tonight, I'm off duty in a few minutes, there will still be left a member of the great t.c.b.s to voice what I dreamed and what we all agreed upon. For the death of one of its members cannot, I am determined, dissolve the t.c.b.s. Death can make us loathsome and helpless as individuals, but it cannot put an end to the immortal 4. May God bless you, my dear John Ronald, and may you say the things I have tried to say long after I am not there to say them, if such be my lot. Yours ever, G.B.S." Gosh, now if these words are powerful for us to hear over 100 years after they were written, you can imagine how impactful this was for Tolkien. He's not only carrying the horrors of the warfare that he himself experienced, he's carrying the unlived lives and legacies of his friends who have passed on. And in many ways, it was those friendships with the t.c.b.s that really was kind of the rallying cry or encouragement for Tolkien to begin working on the mythology that would become The Lord of the Rings. Around this time, Christopher Wiseman, the only surviving member of the t.c.b.s, wrote to Tolkien, encouraging him, saying, "You should start the epic." And he did. Tolkien began writing what he called the Book of Lost Tales, which we now know today as the Silmarillion. And Tolkien would spend nearly 60 years perfecting this ancient mythology, essentially this ancient history, mythology of Middle-earth, and Middle-earth being derived from Midgard, from Old Norse, which means this earth, our earth, but in an older time. So I want to pause here real quick because one of the things I really loved about this biography that I thought was really interesting and I wanted to highlight in this video was all the little glimmers of inspiration that kind of fed into Tolkien's mind and imagination that would eventually form into The Lord of the Rings. So I'll read off a short list of these kind of inspirations that I found the most interesting. First of all, the summer before going to Oxford, Tolkien embarked on a backpacking trip with his brother and several friends through Switzerland. And on this trip, Tolkien found a picture postcard of a painting called Der Berggeist, which means mountain spirit. Later he would scribble on this postcard, "Origin of Gandalf." So another one of these little glimmers of inspiration comes from a man named William Morris. So William Morris was an author that Tolkien really admired, and his book House of the Wolfings is all about this kind of family tribe, this house that's living in a land threatened by the invading force of Romans. And this house tribe, this family, lives in a clearing of a forest called Mirkwood. This was cool. So one of Tolkien's earliest stories was called The Dragon's Visit, and it describes the ravages of this dragon who arrives at Bimble Bay and encounters a Miss Biggins. Another poem tells of a strange, slimy creature with pale, luminous eyes named Glip that lives beneath the floor of a cave. Another one is that on a family holiday to Cornwall in 1932, Tolkien said that there was a curious local character, an old man, who used to go about swapping gossip and weather wisdom and such like. To amuse my boys, I named him Gaffer Gamgee, and the name became part of family lore to fix on old chaps of the kind. And another one, this might be my favorite, but Tolkien's Aunt Jane lived on a farm in Worcestershire, and because this farm was kind of set at the end of this lane that could go no further, locals often referred to it as Bag End. Anyway, I just love learning about these little glimmers of inspiration that people pick up over the course of their lives that eventually kind of feed into the story that they're going to tell. Tolkien said it best, of course, when he put it this way. He said that stories grow like a seed in the dark out of the leaf mold of the mind, out of all that has been seen or thought or read that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps. So now at last we come to the writing of The Hobbit, because it's impossible to separate the writing of The Lord of the Rings from The Hobbit, because that's really where it all began. And it's interesting to see how this arrived in Tolkien's life, because obviously he was enamored with mythologies and with languages, and at this time in his life, he was a college professor at Oxford, so he devoted a lot of his time and attention to tutoring and lecturing. But in addition to that, he also had this side of him that was fascinated by mythologies and languages, and he was working on this epic, this kind of great mythology of England. But in addition to the academic and the mythological sides of his life, he also had just his family life. And of course, we now have all of his letters from Father Christmas that he would write diligently to his children over the years with illustrations and everything. And The Hobbit really kind of started as one of those tales that he told his kids. So it started on a summer day in 1930 when Tolkien was around 38 years old. I can remember sitting one summer with a pile of dreary exam papers in a chair near the front window of my study on 20 Northmoor Road. I came across a blessed blank page and scrawled on it without conscious reflection or effort of invention, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." So Tolkien wrote that first chapter of The Hobbit and then just kind of left it alone. It was one of many short stories that he had kind of started and abandoned. But about a year later, in 1931, he ended up returning to The Hobbit. Now, of course, Tolkien was a very busy lecturer and tutorer, so he didn't have a ton of time during terms to actually write or do any kind of creative writing at all. So he saved most of his writing, and they kind of happened in spurts on his vacations and holidays. So Carpenter writes this: "The manuscript of The Hobbit suggests that the actual writing of the main part of the story was done over a comparatively short period of time. The ink, paper, and handwriting styles are consistent. The pages are numbered consecutively, and there are almost no chapter divisions. It would also appear that Tolkien wrote the story fluently and with little hesitation, for there are comparatively few erasers or revisions." So as Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, he also read it aloud to his children, and this comes from the Tolkien estate. This is a recollection of Christopher, Tolkien's son, of kind of hearing the story of The Hobbit read aloud. "On one occasion, I interrupted, 'Last time you said Bilbo's front door was blue. And you said that Thorin had a golden tassel on his head. But you've just said that Bilbo's front door was green and that Thorin's hood was silver.' At which point my father muttered, damn the boy, and then strode across the room to his desk to make a note. So apparently we have Christopher to thank for the impeccable consistency of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So one of the biggest differences between the older draft and the later one is obviously that the names were very different. So originally the dragon was called Prifton, and the name Gandalf was actually given to the chief dwarf that would later become Thorin Oakenshield. And then the wizard was actually named Bledorthin. And the draft was pretty far advanced before he kind of shuffled these names around. So he ended up renaming the dragon to Smaug, which is from the Germanic smugen, which means to squeeze through a hole. I thought that was kind of funny. The name Gandalf, like all the other dwarf names, came from the Elder Edda, but the Icelandic meaning of Gandalf is sorcerer elf, and that kind of fit with the wizard, so it ended up becoming the wizard's name, so the wizard Gandalf. Thank goodness. So it seems like the writing progressed pretty fluently up until it came time to kill the dragon Smaug. And at that point, it seemed like Tolkien got a little bit stumped. He started to do this thing where he would write out in brief shorthand kind of notes on what he thought could happen in the narrative. And this is something that he took forward into the writing of Lord of the Rings quite a bit. So what he wrote for The Hobbit near the end, as he's trying to kind of flesh out the next scene, is he wrote, Bilbo plunges in his little magic knife. Throws of dragon, smashes walls and entrance to tunnel. But obviously this idea didn't quite fit with Bilbo's character arc, and it also wasn't quite a grand enough death for Smaug. So he ended up rejecting that idea. He kind of put the draft away for a while. But he did share the manuscript in its unfinished form with a few family friends, including a student of his. And that student had a friend in the publishing industry, and she actually told her friend about the existence of this unfinished but remarkable children's story that Professor Tolkien was working on. So this publisher actually reached out to Tolkien herself, asking if she could read this manuscript. She read it, she liked it, and she asked him to kind of finish the novel so it could be considered for publication in the following year. So that was kind of the push that Tolkien needed to write out the very last chapters of the story. So he changed the ending so that Bard the Bowman killed the dragon Smaug, he wrote the Battle of the Five Armies, and then he narrated about Bilbo's return to the Shire, back home again. So that was that. The book was published in September 1937. The first edition was sold out by Christmas, and it quickly became an international bestseller. And when the publisher realized what a success The Hobbit had turned out to be, he wrote to Tolkien saying, "A large public will be clamoring next year to hear more from you about hobbits. Ain't that the truth?" And that brings us to The Lord of the Rings. So I'm going to pause here, take a quick break, and go make a cup of tea, and then we can jump back into it. Okay, I'm back. All right. So The Lord of the Rings then really began as a sequel to The Hobbit. His publisher knew that the public was interested in hearing more stories about hobbits, so he asked Tolkien if he had any writing that might kind of suit as a direct follow-up to The Hobbit. Tolkien submitted a number of his poems, short stories, and even parts of the Book of Lost Tales to his publisher, but none of them were really suitable for being a direct sequel to The Hobbit. So on the 19th of December, 1937, Tolkien wrote to the editorial staff at his publishing company saying, "I've written the first chapter of a new story about hobbits, a long-expected party." Carpenter writes, "The new story began rather like the first Hobbit tale. Mr. Bilbo-Baggins of Hobbiton gives a party to celebrate his birthday, and after making a speech to his guests, he slips on the magic ring that he acquired in The Hobbit and vanishes. The reason for his disappearance, as given in the first draft, is that Bilbo had not got any money or jewels left, and was going off in search of more dragon gold. At this point, the first version of the opening chapter breaks off, unfinished." But naturally, this was a bit of a contradiction because at the very end of The Hobbit, he had said that Bilbo remained very happy to the end of his days, and those were extraordinarily long. So any kind of adventure worth telling was probably going to contradict that statement. So Tolkien kind of cycled through a few different options at this point. He considered having a dragon attack the Shire, he considered marrying Bilbo off to Primula Brandybuck, and then finally he kind of decided to make a new Hobbit protagonist that was going to be Bilbo's son. So he gave this new Hobbit the name of a family of toy koala bears that his children owned, and that is, drumroll, Bingo. So with Bingo, the Hobbit, at the head of his tale, Tolkien scribbled down a new idea: make Return of Ring a motive. And this was because the ring was a direct link to the Hobbit, but it was also one of the few elements in the Hobbit that wasn't fully developed. So with this in mind, Tolkien scribbled down a few more notes to himself. He wrote, "The ring, whence its origin? Necromancer? Not very dangerous when used for good purpose, but it exacts its penalty. You must either lose it or yourself." So he rewrote the opening chapter at this point. He also changed the protagonist from being Bilbo's son to Bilbo's nephew, and he also gave this protagonist a new name. You're not ready for this. Bingo Bolger-Baggins. Yeah. And then immediately after that, Tolkien jumped into writing the second chapter, Three's Company, where he wrote about how Bingo, with his cousins Odo and Frodo, set off on a journey across the countryside under the stars. "Stories tend to get out of hand," Tolkien wrote to his publisher a few weeks later, "and this has taken an unpremeditated turn." He was referring to the appearance, unplanned by him, of a sinister Black Rider, who is clearly searching for the hobbits. He finished this third chapter called A Shortcut to Mushrooms and sent that off to the publisher for comment. And life got busy. A few weeks later, he ended up writing down a new note. Bingo is going to do something about the necromancer who is planning an attack on the Shire. They have to find Gollum and find where he got the ring, for 3 are wanted. So he kind of felt like he had some sort of direction, but he kind of got stuck here. He didn't really know where to take the story next. So instead, he kind of turned his attention to organizing his thoughts on the central matter of the ring. And around this point, he began to write some dialogue between Bingo and the elf Gildor, kind of explaining the nature of the ring and where it came from. So according to Gildor in this scene, the ring was one of a number of rings that were made by the necromancer, and he was looking for them. The Black Riders were kind of ring wraiths that were made permanently invisible by other rings. Through the course of that conversation, Tolkien, alongside Bingo and Gildor, kind of realizes that the ring needs to be carried many hundreds of miles to the dark land of Mordor, and they are cast into the great cracks of the earth where a great fire burns. So this dialogue obviously became kind of that conversation between Frodo and Gandalf in the chapter The Shadow of the Past. So Tolkien continued to write. He took his protagonists across the countryside where they encountered Tom Bombadil. On the 31st of August, 1938, Tolkien wrote to his publisher saying that the book was flowing along and getting quite out of hand. It has reached about chapter 7 and progresses towards quite unforeseen goals. 2 quites in 2 sentences. That's saying something. So here, Tolkien went on holiday with his family to Sidmouth in autumn 1938, and he was able to really pour a lot of time into the story. At this point, he was really able to kind of get some clear answers and direction of where the story was headed. So he began by bringing the hobbits to a village inn at Bree, where they met a very strange character, a hobbit named Trotter. Yes, that is right, Aragorn was originally a hobbit. Can you imagine? Come on, this is why we love revision. So yes, obviously later, this character was going to be recast as this heroic king whose return to power gave the 3rd volume its name, but at this point, it was just another hobbit in like a squadron of hobbits that were marching to Rivendell. So later on in his life, Tolkien reflected back on this period and he wrote this: I met a lot of things on the way that astonished me. Tom Bombadil I knew already, but I had never been to Bree. Strider sitting in the corner at that inn was a shock, and I had no more idea who he was than had Frodo. The Mines of Moria had been a mere name, and of Lothlorien no word had reached my mortal ears till I came there. Far away I knew there were the Horse Lords on the confines of an ancient kingdom of men, but Fangorn Forest was an unforeseen adventure. I had never heard of the House of Eorl, nor the Stewards of Gondor. Most disquieting of all, Saruman had never been revealed to me, and I was as mystified as Frodo at Gandalf's failure to appear on September 22nd. But nevertheless, he continued writing. He allowed the story to kind of open up and breathe and just followed its new direction. He ended up bringing the hobbits all the way to Rivendell. Around this time, he also scribbled on a spare sheet of paper, "Too many hobbits. Also, Bolger-Baggins, a bad name. Let Bingo equal Frodo." And then below that, he added, "No, I am now too used to Bingo." All this time as he was writing, there was the matter of why this ring was so important to everybody. But around the time they reached Rivendell, these ideas were beginning to crystallize, and he wrote, "Bilbo's ring proved to be the one ruling ring. All others had come back to Mordor, but this one had been lost. The one ruling ring that controlled all the others, the ring that was the source and instrument of the power of Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor. The ring that must be carried to its destruction by the hobbits, or else the whole world would come under Sauron's dominion. Now everything fell into place, and the story was lifted from the juvenile level of the Hobbit into the sphere of grand and heroic romance. There was even a name for it. When next he wrote about it to his publishers, Tolkien referred to it as The Lord of the Rings." So all of these ideas had crystallized for him while he was on this holiday to Sidmouth, and once he got home, he spent much of autumn 1938 writing book 2, and at this point, the only major difference between the original and then what we have today is that the name, obviously, of the protagonist changed. I guess there was a brief period in the summer of 1939 where he actually considered rewriting everything with Bilbo as the protagonist. Carpenter said this was presumably on the principle that the hero of the first book ought to be the hero of the second. But he eventually went back to the use of the Bingo character. But as the name Bingo had now become quite unbearable to him in view of the serious nature the story had taken on, he changed it to Frodo, a name that already belonged to a minor character. And Frodo it remained. Okay, so this is about the point in the video essay where I need to crack open the giant tome that is Lord of the Rings so that we can kind of track the progress of Tolkien's writing through the manuscript. So around late 1940, the writing of The Lord of the Rings paused for almost a year, and Tolkien had written everything up to the point where the Fellowship finds Balin's tomb in Moria, but eventually Tolkien drew up outlines for the end of the story, which he didn't imagine was going to be more than just a couple chapters away. But around this time, he also kind of started sketching out that scene where the 2 hobbits encounter Treebeard for the first time, and Treebeard is, of course, modeled off his very dear friend and colleague C.S. Lewis. In December 1942, he wrote, "It is now approaching completion. I hope to get a little free time this vacation, and might hope to finish it off early next year. It has reached chapter 16, and will require at least 6 more to finish. These are already sketched." So this chapter 16, which is the original chapter for Flotsam and Jetsam, was only at the end of what would become book 3, and there were not 6 but 31 more chapters to go before the book would be complete. So he was only about halfway through the book in its final form. So Tolkien tried to continue writing in the months that followed, but by summer of 1943 he admitted that he was dead stuck. This was due in large part to his perfectionism, and Carpenter kind of breaks it down like this. He said that Tolkien made endless calculations of time and distance, drawing up elaborate charts concerning events in the story, showing dates, the days of the week, the hours, and sometimes even the direction of the wind and the phase of the moon. Long afterwards, Tolkien said, "I wanted people simply to get inside this story and take it, in a sense, as actual history." But in addition to that perfectionism side, he was also reaching this point where the story divided into several independent and in themselves complicated chains of events. And while he imagined it would only take him 2 or 3 chapters to get Frodo and Sam Gamgee to Mordor, he could not yet face unraveling the complexities of the simultaneous events in Gondor and Rohan. It had taken him nearly 6 years to bring the story this far. How could he ever find the time and energy to finish it, let alone to complete and revise the Silmarillion, which still clamored for attention? He was 51, tired, and fearful that in the end he would achieve nothing. So because of all this, by the beginning of 1944, the story had laid untouched for months. And bless his heart, C.S. Lewis noticed that Tolkien had kind of withdrawn from the story, and he encouraged Tolkien to just try giving it another shot, to keep going and see where the story would lead. And thus, encouraged by his friend, Tolkien picked up the story again, and in April and May he made a lot of leeway in Book 4, which kind of carries Frodo and Sam across the Dead Marshes as they approach Mordor. So as Tolkien began working on the story again in earnest, he also began writing very detailed updates to his son Christopher, who was training as a pilot in South Africa at the time. And these letters are kind of funny to read through because not only do they provide kind of updates on The Lord of the Rings and his progress through it, it's also kind of interspersed with kind of random updates on afternoon lawn mowing and plumbing and gardening and tutoring and all the other things that Tolkien was involved in at the time. So in this biography, Carpenter kind of pulls out excerpts from his letters to Christopher and tracks Tolkien's progress through the writing of The Dead Marshes all the way up to Shelob's Lair and beyond. Just to kind of give you an overview of what these look like, I'll read you one. So this is from 25th of April. Gave a poor lecture, saw the Lewises and C.W. Whitehorse for half hour, mowed 3 lawns and wrote letter to John, and struggled with recalcitrant passage in the ring. At this point I required to know how much later the moon gets up each night when nearing full, and how to stew a rabbit. On May the 4th, he writes, "A new character has come on the scene. I'm sure I did not invent him. I did not even want him, though I like him, and there he came walking into the woods of Ithilien, Faramir, the brother of Boromir, and he is holding up the catastrophe by a lot of stuff about the history of Gondor and Rohan. If he goes on much more, a lot of him will have to be removed to the appendices, where already some fascinating material in the Hobbit tobacco industry and the languages of the West have gone." And clearly by this point he had conceived of the idea of the appendices, which were kind of his way of recording all the elements that might slow down the main plot, but which seemed still very important to him, like historical annals, alphabets, languages, genealogies, that kind of thing. So just kind of skipping along, on the 31st of May, Tolkien records that he had stayed up late writing the passage of Frodo through Shelob's Lair and his capture by orcs in the passes of Mordor. By sitting up all hours, I managed it, and read the last 2 chapters, Shelob's Lair and the Choice of Master Samwise, to C.S. Lewis on Monday morning. He approved with unusual fervor and was actually affected to tears by the last chapter, so it seems to be keeping up. This whole feverish burst of inspiration got Tolkien about this far through The Lord of the Rings. So he had written pretty much everything up through the end of Two Towers, and all of Return of the King was still unwritten at this point. But after this feverish burst of inspiration, Tolkien was exhausted and totally burnt out on writing The Lord of the Rings. And I thought this was really interesting that from August 1944 till September of 1947, Tolkien made little to no progress at all on The Lord of the Rings. Now obviously a lot was going on in his life at this time. Second World War ended, he became a professor and fellow at Merton College, and he moved houses, so there was a lot going on academically and in his personal life. But for 3 years, he pretty much wrote nothing on The Lord of the Rings. For 3 years. Like, can we just take a moment to think about this? For all of you writers out there, myself included, if the master of fantasy felt blocked for 3 years writing Lord of the Rings, that makes me feel so much better about all the times that I've ever been stuck in my manuscript. I hope you take this as an encouragement that this is totally a normal part of the process, and even Tolkien himself felt stuck. But thankfully, The Lord of the Rings did not just sink into oblivion. There was obviously the pressure of the publishers to write this sequel. Tolkien had been continuing to update his publishers on the progress through the manuscript. So By summer of 1947, Tolkien mustered up the last strength he needed to kind of surge through to the ending of the book. So from here on out, the story that Tolkien was writing is very, very similar to the story that as we know it today. So he finished writing the climactic chapters, taking his heroes all the way to Mordor, to the Black Gate, and to the Crack of Doom, and he was able to bring the story to a close. Another thing that I loved learning was that Tolkien says he actually wept while writing the hero's welcome that's given to the hobbits on the fields of Cormallen after the ring is destroyed. And that's of course that really powerful scene that was transposed into the "You bow to no one" scene in Return of the King. So I think that's beautiful that even Tolkien was moved to tears by that scene. Go figure. Tolkien loved tying up loose ends, and he wanted to make sure that there were no loose ends in this great story, that everything had its proper resolution. So long ago in the writing process, Tolkien had resolved that his principal characters would sail west from the Grey Havens at the end of the novel. So he wrote the Grey Havens scene, and then he also wrote an epilogue where Samwise Gamgee told his children what happened to each of those principal characters that did not sail west. And that epilogue ended with Sam listening to the sigh and murmur of the sea upon the shores of Middle-earth. So that was finally the end of the novel, but Tolkien, of course being Tolkien, went back and made sure to revise and perfect most of the manuscript. So he later said, "I don't suppose there are many sentences that have not been niggled over." So the full manuscript in its revised entirety was not finished until autumn of 1949, nearly 12 years after he wrote those opening lines. The manuscript, when it was finished, was just shy of 500,000 words, and it would be 16 years from writing the opening chapter to the publication date. When the manuscript was done, Tolkien sent the final typescript to C.S. Lewis, and this is what Lewis had to say about it. "I have drained the rich cup and satisfied a long thirst. Once it really gets underway, the steady upward slope of grandeur and terror is almost unequaled in the whole range of narrative art known to me. In two virtues I think it excels: sheer subcreation, Bombadil, Barrow Wights, Elves, Ents, as if from inexhaustible resources and construction. Also in gravitas. No romance can repel the charge of escapism with such confidence. If it errs in precisely the opposite direction. All victories of hope deferred and the merciless piling up of odds against the heroes are near to being too painful. And the long coda after the eucatastrophe, whether you intended it or no, has the effect of reminding us that victory is as transitory as conflict, and so leaving a final impression of profound melancholy." And then after a few comments, Lewis writes, "I congratulate you. All the long years you have spent on it are justified." And Carpenter closes by writing this. Tolkien himself did not think it was flawless, but he told Stanley Unwin, his publisher, "It is written in my lifeblood, such as that is, thick or thin, and I can no other." And obviously it would go on to become not only the most influential fantasy novel of all time, but also one of the masterpieces of the century. And that, my friends, is the story of how Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. And as I am sure you could tell throughout this video, this book is a treasure trove of information, and if you fancy yourself a Tolkien fanatic, I would highly recommend this one. It was just a joy to read. So you'll have to share in the comments what surprised you most. For me, I think it would be a tie between knowing that Aragorn was originally a hobbit, or that Frodo's name was Bingo Bolger-Baggins. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you did enjoy it, it genuinely would help me out so much if you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more bookish deep dives like this. And without any further ado, I'll catch all of you guys in the next video. Bye.